Hi. Before we start, we'd like to acknowledge the Turrbal and Yagara as the First Nation owners of the lands where this research took place. We pay respect to their elders, laws, customs, and creation spirits. We recognize that these lands have always been places of teaching, research, and learning. If another world is possible, it cannot be built with the conceptual tools inherited from the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. It cannot be built with the master's tools. As Audre Lorde reminded us a number of years back, for the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. This is a quote from Mignolo and Walsh in their book on decoloniality. Hi, we're Jane and Manu, and today we want to talk to you about things that we're passionate about: type and maps. We love them, but they turn out to embody some aspects of and about the systems that underline our world and propagate the tools of modernity that keep rebuilding that same old house. To enable the Pluriversal project, we need new tools that emerge from the decolonial project, tools that emerge from the Pluriverse itself. And we need to make sure that these tools will not keep rebuilding the master's house. Today we want to talk about what Jane and I have been calling the systems of the underside. Those systems established during the Renaissance and the Enlightenment that define and propagate modernity, and that are so embedded in our cultures and lives that become part of them without ever being questioned. We'll talk about mundane things like maps and the Latin alphabet, for example. It is hard to think of a world without maps or writing. Our objective here is not to deny these tools. On the contrary, we want to look at them from a critical perspective and review their cultural role on creating universality. One verse, one word, one way to say things, one to rule them all, as opposed to pluriversality, where many forms of knowing, understanding, living, and representing the world can exist together.
Maps and type both communicate. They're graphic design artifacts that act as an interface to meaning organized by a set of symbols. They're both read and they're both understood as requiring legibility, or at least being open to interpretation. Both are powerful, framing our understandings of the world. Maps and type both offer a practical form of information communication. And this practicality and our understanding of maps as such has become conflated with the systems used to organize the information. So here, this 1812 schoolgirl sewing exercise manages to look like a map in her eyes because it's faithful to the system of latitude and longitude that conveniently at once cuts up the world, enables navigation across the open oceans, and distorts the shapes of the continents. This distortion is echoed in the very being of the continents. The tiny British Isles up at the top, small but sitting pretty. The enormity of the African continent squashed and minimized. We're so used to these maps and the world cut up and forced into a convenient grid, almost like a corset, that the grid takes over. We've learnt the grid. We've interiorized it to the extent that we can no longer actively see what's happening.
We have interiorized and learned also how to read and write using Latin typography, which is just one of the many writing systems in the world, clearly the dominant one. At one side, it has allowed us, and still does, to register and share information around and about the world. On the other side, it has homogenized and in certain ways erased or made redundant many of the other forms of writing that existed before and still exist. The fact is that while Latin writing does help share knowledge and ideas, it is impossible to decouple the meaning from the shapes. The writing system itself is also part of that communication. And this is how the system is imposed. And they both use that same neat grid and measurements. And we are all used to it. We all know about how maps divided and helped colonizers conquer the world, And we all know that type also has its lines and grids, but it is when we put both systems together, both grids, one to divide the world and one to contain the word, that is when it all becomes a bit sinister.
The power of the grid is that it shapes and distorts other stories. We might see a representation of Indigenous landscapes, such as Brett Levy's work in Digital Songlines, but it is created in the very grid that actually has violated its original meaning. It doesn't need to be this way. Why not, as Vincent Serico's work shows, why not think about mapping as another form without a grid, but with lines of interconnectivity? Why not think about the world as an embodied thing, a shape that you can actually feel rather than see?
And we ask the same questions about type. Learning the system is what makes it possible for us to understand it, to be able to read. But the Latin system is only one of them. There are and there have been other systems which embed and reveal their own stories. This, for example, is the Vai syllabary from Liberia. It was designed in the 1800s, and even though it has very different forms and shapes, it already conforms to a grid, to a typographic grid, European style. Less conformative, pre-colonial expressions like the Inca quipus, believed to be used to represent numbers, which is the obvious reading from a Western perspective, are likely to have been used for stories, myths, songs, or other much more complex and abstract expressions, unknown to the Western world. And that, sadly, will never be known, how that system works, because those stories were also erased by the system, and somehow other stories continue to be. The beautiful thing is that the unknown can reveal the unexpected, like a writing system that is also used as a map system, such as the Samoan tattoos. Symbols that tell stories, represent connection to place, and show the ways through the seas to new lands and back home. Our cultural artifacts and designs help create the cultures and worlds we live in. They tell stories of their own. We need to question these artifacts to reveal the voices, the multiple ways of knowing and being in and with the world. Stories that have been silenced, ways of living that still are silenced through the systems of the underside. So, in order to create this new convivial, dialogical and plural world, we need to question ourselves and our positioning as designers. We need to question design itself. We need to learn to unlearn.